There's a very specific kind of fear that lives only in the woods. It's not the same as being scared in an old house or walking through a cemetery at night. Because in a house, you can turn on the light, and in a cemetery, you can usually see the road. But in the woods, the darkness has layers. There are trees falling on trees, branches over branches, shadows that don't stay still, and every sound seems to be coming from everywhere all at once. A twig snaps behind you, and you tell yourself that it has to be an animal, right? Or you think it's the wind, or you think of some other logical explanation. But somewhere just beyond the trees, you get this feeling that you're being watched and that something isn't quite right in those woods. And that's the kind of fear we're talking about on today's episode of The Spooky Files. Hey everyone, welcome back to The Spooky Files. If you're returning, thank you so much for coming back. And if you're new here, I'm so glad to have you. I'm your host, Mary Ellen Quigley. This is where we dive into the paranormal, the unexplained, the I swear I saw something, but I don't want to admit it moments that we all have and now have a place to talk about them. Today's episode is called The Thing in the Woods. And I have to admit, this one is already creepy because the woods can be a very scary place. But when you add in a little paranormal twist, that just makes it even worse. And if you think about why forest encounters are so terrifying, it's because when you're in the forest, especially if you're alone, your mind is already working overtime. You're listening harder, watching closer, trying to make sense of every sound. So when something happens that doesn't fit what you're expecting, like footsteps when you know there's no one there, a figure standing in the trees, but there shouldn't be anyone else out in the woods with you. And when your body suddenly tells yourself to run before your mind even has a chance to catch up, that's when things get a little wild and crazy. So today's episode is going to be a little bit different than the usual because we're going to look at a couple of real haunted locations, and then we're going to talk through some stories that were found online, either from Reddit posts, TikToks, and just all across the internet about people who have had creepy experiences in the woods. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Our first story is about the Hoia Baciu Forest in Romania. One of the most famous forests associated with this kind of dread is the Hoia Baciu Forest. It's located in Transylvania, which already gives you a certain atmosphere before we tell you anything else about the story. So Hoia Baciu has been called one of the most haunted forests in the world, and some people call it the Bermuda Triangle of Romania. And depending on who you ask, it's a place where there are UFO sightings, strange lights, twisted trees, disembodied voices, invisible touches, and the overwhelming sensation that you are being watched. One of the most famous stories connected to the forest goes back to the late 1960s when a military technician named Emil Barnea reportedly photographed a UFO above the forest. And that incident became one of the evidence that helped push Hoia Baciu into international paranormal lore. A Romanian tour company still references this case as part of the forest's modern reputation. There's also a place in the forest that's called the Round Clearing, and it's often described as a circular area where trees do not grow the same way they do around it, and some paranormal tours call it a dead vegetation zone. Now, I want to be careful here because a lot of what surrounds Hoia Baciu is legend, tourism, and testimony. The Guardian recently pointed out that scientific evidence for supernatural claims there remain inconclusive, but the same article also notes that the forest has a long-standing reputation for eerie reports including whispers, touches, twisted trees, UFO lore, and visitors feeling like something unseen is present. And what makes the Hoia Baciu a perfect location for this episode isn't just that there's a ghost in the woods, but it's more like the forest itself feels awake or alive in some kind of way. People often describe walking under the twisted branches in the forest and feeling like they've crossed into the wrong place, like the trees aren't just trees, but the spaces in between them are holding something, almost as though you're walking through different dimensions as you walk through the forest. And whether you believe the Hoya Baciu is paranormal or psychological or a mixture of folklore and atmosphere, the stories all have the same kind of fear. Our second real life location is the Aokigahara Forest in Japan, and this is known as the Sea of Trees. It sits near Mount Fuji, and official tourism sources describe it as a dense forest of mixed coniferous and broadleaf trees. It stretches about 30 square kilometers, and the forest floor is made of volcanic rock and lava that flowed after Mount Fuji erupted in the year 864. So that alone gives the place an unusual feeling since the ground is dried lava. You're walking over old lava, so the ground is uneven, the trees are dense. Sound can feel swallowed up because of the way that sound bounces off of this lava, and it's easy to understand why people feel like it's disorienting. Japan's official travel site also acknowledges the folklore attached to the Aokigahara forest and notes that according to Japanese folklore, yurei, or tormented ghosts, are said to haunt the area. The forest also has a tragic modern reputation, and I don't want to sensationalize that, but this is a real place that's connected to grief, mental health struggles, and families. So I want to keep this episode focused on the atmosphere and the folklore. But this is a place with a very heavy story, and people in Japan have been known to go to this forest to unalive themselves. So I want to be careful about how we talk about that part of it, because whether we're talking about the Hoya Baciu in Romania or the Aokigahara forest in Japan, the pattern is similar, right? Dense trees, silence, folklore about spirits, and people entering the woods and feeling as though they are not alone. And in the Aokigahara's case, even official travel information mentions that wildlife such as wild boar and Asian black bears can be present in the area, which also adds another layer because sometimes the thing watching you from the trees may not be supernatural at all, but it might just be a black bear. But that doesn't make it any less frightening. In some ways, it may make it a little worse because when you are alone in the woods and you feel eyes on you, the question isn't always, is it a ghost? Sometimes the question is, what kind of thing has noticed me and how fast should I run? So, with those places in mind, let's move on to stories from real people. And the stories I'm sharing are now the kind of forced encounters that people report, like footsteps, more of the paranormal feel. So, I'd be interested in hearing what you guys think about the ones that were sent in. And story one is called It Walked Where I Walked. And this one was sent in by Amanda. So Amanda grew up in a small town where everyone knows everyone, and the woods behind her parents' house was not considered scary. They were just woods. And as a child, she would play back in the woods with her cousins. They built forts out of fallen branches, made trails where there weren't supposed to be trails, and spent the entire summer afternoon pretending they were explorers. By the time Amanda was in her 20s, those woods felt less like wilderness and more like just an extension of home. So one October evening, when she came over to visit her parents, she realized that their old dog had slipped out the back door. And she didn't think twice about grabbing a flashlight and walking into the tree line. The sun had just gone down, so it was getting dark, but it wasn't fully dark yet. Amanda was calling out her dog's name. At first, she heard nothing but dry leaves scraping across the ground. And then ahead of her, she could hear the jingle of the dog's collar. So she followed it, thinking she would catch up to the dog when it got stopped by smelling a tree or whatever dogs are smelling out there. The trail was familiar. It's one she had taken a million times before. So she didn't think much of it. It curved down a shallow creek bed and then would climb towards a ridge where the trees were closer together. So Amanda called out again, hoping to catch the dog before they got into that denser part of the woods. The dog barked, a sharp bark, then silence. So she kept walking. And that's when she heard the footsteps behind her. Now, she assumed it was her dad, thinking he must have gone out to help her. But when she turned around, there was no one there. So she took her flashlight and shined it over the trail behind her. Saw nothing, just leaves and same sticks that she had stepped over. So she called, "Dad?" No answer. Then ahead of her, the dog barked again. So she turned around and just kept walking, trying to follow the dog. And as she was walking, behind her, she could hear the footsteps again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. And every time she stepped, so did whatever this was behind her. So eventually she just stopped, and the footsteps stopped too. She stood completely still, holding her breath, trying to see if whatever was behind her would move and she could pinpoint where exactly they were. And what creeped her out the most was when she stopped, suddenly the woods went quiet. Not in the way like you would expect, but everything went quiet. The crickets stopped, the traffic from the road stopped, even the wind seemed to have stopped. She was so scared that she decided, I'm getting out of here. She took one step, and the thing behind her took a step. Then she did something she couldn't explain. Instead of running, she just said very sharply, no. Just one word, as if whatever was behind her had asked a question. After a few seconds, nothing happened. And then suddenly, the branch behind her cracked so loudly that she felt like it was exploding, and she ran. She dropped the flashlight and ran all the way back home, and behind her, the footsteps ran too. As she reached the edge of the woods and she could see the porch light from the house, the sound behind her suddenly stopped. Amanda burst into the yard and nearly collided with her father, who was standing near the entrance of the woods, and next to him sat the dog. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. Her dad kept asking what happened, but all she could do was point back at the trees. And that's when her father's face changed. Because just at the edge of the woods, beyond the reach of the porch light, something was moving. Not walking out or coming closer, but just shifting from behind one tree to another. It was tall, but too tall to be human. Her dad yelled, "Who's there?" The shape stopped moving. Then it leaned out from behind the tree, and Amanda could see a pale, narrow face with no eyes and no mouth, just a black, oval face. Her father grabbed her arm and pulled her inside the house. They locked the doors, turned on every light, and called the police. The police found Amanda's flashlight on the trail the next morning, but they never found whoever it was in the woods. And after that, she never went back into the woods by herself. So I have to say that this one was definitely scary because I was expecting it to be the kind of paranormal encounter where she never saw what was behind her and it was just an unseen ghost following her through the woods. But the fact that when she got out, her father and her both saw a figure standing in the woods, and the fact that this figure had no face, would absolutely terrify me. And it really makes me wonder what this could have been that was in the woods. It's obviously not a ghost. It's not Bigfoot because it's not furry. I have no idea. What do you guys think this could have been? Because I'm really curious as to what she saw, and she's never seen it again. So I have more questions than I have answers on this one. Story number 2 I found on a Reddit post, and this one comes from a person named Tyler, and it's called Between the Trees. Now, Tyler is not someone who believes in ghosts. He's a hunter, a camper, and the kind of person who always has a practical explanation for everything. And if you hear something in the woods, he could usually identify it just because of his experience as a hunter. So he knows what sounds, deer, foxes, coyotes, owls, raccoons, what trees settling sound like, wind shear, all of that. He knows the difference between all of those sounds, which is why this particular experience scared him so much. So it was during a camping trip with 2 friends, and they had gone to a remote area that they visited every fall. There was nothing really unique about this location and no haunted history that they knew of. It was just a stretch of woods with a small clearing where they liked to set up camp. And the first night was completely normal. They built a fire, ate dinner, and sat around talking until late in the evening, and they eventually went to sleep. But sometime after midnight, Tyler woke up because the woods had gone silent. Not quiet, but silent, and anyone who spends enough time outdoors knows there is a huge difference between the two. Quiet has texture. Even though there's not a lot of noise, you can still hear things like wind and leaves and insects. But this wasn't silent, this was empty. And Tyler sat there in his tent listening, but then he heard a sound. It was a soft scrape against the nylon of his tent as though someone was touching the tent from the outside. He opened his eyes, and the moonlight was bright enough that he could see the shape of the tent wall above him, and pressed against it from the outside was the outline of a hand. Tyler didn't move for a moment. He was thinking that maybe it was his friend trying to wake him up. And then the hand slowly dragged downward, making a scratching sound as it moved, and then it disappeared. So he grabbed his flashlight and his knife and he sat up and called for his friends. There was no answer. He unzipped his tent as quietly as he could and looked outside. The fire had burned low at that time, and the clearing was pretty bright with the moonlight. And when he looked over, his friends' tents were still zipped. There was no one near him. Then he saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A person was standing between two trees. At least, that's what he tried to make it into. But the proportions were wrong. The shape was tall and narrow, but its head was tilted to the side. One arm hung straight down, almost to the knees, and the other one was normal-sized. Tyler stared at it, it stared back. And then one of his friends woke up and called from the tent, "What are you doing out there?" This time the figure stepped backward and ran into the trees. Tyler woke everyone up. They checked the area with flashlights, but they found no footprints, no broken branches, and no sign that anyone had been there. But they were all terrified, so they packed up their things and they left. I have to say that I also have no idea what this creature was. It definitely seems like it was person-like, but maybe not an actual person, or maybe a person that had some kind of a deformity or something is the only thing I can think of. But I'm glad they left when they did, because I definitely would not have been able to stay. And that's the thing about a tent at night. A tent gives you the illusion of safety because it covers you up, you can't see the outside, but it is also just a thin nylon tent. The idea that something could be standing so close to you and only is separated by a thin piece of fabric is absolutely terrifying. And I think that's the part of camping that some people either love or absolutely hate. And our last story number 3, is called The Deer Trail, and this one comes from Rachel. Rachel's family owned a few acres of wooded property, and there was a narrow deer trail that cut through the back part of it. It was not an official trail, just a path worn into the ground by animals over time. And Rachel used it often when she needed to clear her head. She liked walking back there because it was peaceful and because she knew the area well enough that she never felt unsafe. Until one afternoon in early November, it was cold but not freezing, and most of the leaves have already fallen to the ground, so the woods were more open than usual, and Rachel could see farther between the trees than she could in summer. She had been walking for maybe 10 minutes when she noticed something strange. She smelled something foul, but it didn't smell like a dead animal, more like wet fur and old pennies. So she stopped and looked around, and that's when she heard someone whistle. 3 notes, soft and almost playful. Rachel turned around expecting to maybe see her brother or a neighbor messing with her, but there was no one there. And when she called out, "Hello," that same 3-note whistle came again, this time from farther ahead. Rachel should have just turned around and ran, but at this point she was more annoyed than scared because she was absolutely convinced that someone was playing a prank on her. So she kept walking. The trail dipped into a low part of the woods where the ground was softer, and as she stepped down into it, she noticed footprints in the mud. It almost looked like bear prints, but there were no bears in the woods that she knew of. The toes or claws were pressed deeply into the mud, as though whoever made them had been walking slowly and deliberately. Rachel stared at them for a minute, and then the whistle came again. And this time, it was from right behind her. So she turned around, and standing on the trail about 20 feet away was a figure, tall and covered in fur, looking like a bear, but standing upright like a person and thinner than a bear should have been. Rachel was terrified, so she backed away. And then the figure leaned out farther from behind the tree and whistled those 3 notes. This time, she ran, and she could hear it behind her, not crashing through the woods, but moving slowly through the trees in a way that no person should have been able to move. Every few seconds, it would whistle those same 3 notes. She just kept running as fast as she could until she burst out of the woods into the back field of her house, and she didn't stop running until she reached the porch. Her mother found her crying by the back door. Later, her father and brother went out to check the trail. They found the same muddy footprints, and they followed them for several yards. The prints stopped at the base of a tree, not because the ground got harder, but because the trail ended. They just stopped, as if whatever made them had climbed straight up. But when they looked up into the trees, there was nothing up there. Rachel says that she never walked that trail again, but sometimes her parents say that when they're sitting on the back porch at dusk, they will hear 3 soft notes coming from the woods, and every single time they go inside the house. The whistle, I think, is the creepiest part of this story, but I'm pretty sure that what she saw was a Bigfoot-type creature. At least that's the vibe I'm getting from it. I've never heard of Bigfoot whistling, but it definitely could be possible. Forests are full of stories like that. Voices calling your name, footsteps, whispers from the dark. And if you hear your name in the woods, as they say, no, you didn't. But I'm glad that she ran and got away from whatever this was as quickly as possible. And with all of these stories, I think we are left with many, many more questions than we are answers. And I think that's why Things in the Woods stories stay with us like they do. There's no big reveal, no ghost, no clever ending, just footsteps, a whistle, a shape, a hand against a tent, a feeling that you can't prove, but you also can't forget. And maybe that's the scariest kind of story. The kind where you make it home safely, you lock the door behind you, and you still feel like something followed you all the way to the edge of the light. So I want to know, have you ever felt watched in the woods? Have you ever heard footsteps behind you when there was no one there? Have you ever seen something standing between the trees that you can't explain? Because if so, you're not alone. And that brings us to the end of this episode of The Spooky Files. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Follow me on social media, leave a comment because I love hearing from all of you. If you have a story you'd like me to share on the podcast, you can send an email to thespookyfilespodcast@gmail.com or fill out the Contact Us form on thespookyfilespodcast.com. I read every single email or message, and it helps us build a community of people that don't just love a paranormal or creepy story, but want a safe place to talk about all of the things we don't always admit out loud. Make sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. If you're looking for more paranormal content, check out my other podcast, Hoosier Myths and Legends, where my sister and I share all things spooky from the state of Indiana. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep it spooky, my friends.